Do you ever wonder if people from neighboring countries like Norway or Denmark are more closely related to Swedes than we think? Well, the truth might surprise you. Despite living so close together and sharing much of the same history, the question of who has the closest DNA to Swedish people, Norwegians, or Danes can lead to some fascinating discoveries. In this video, we'll dive into the genetics of these three Scandinavian countries and explore which one has the closest genetic connection to Sweden. It's a question that sparks curiosity and, believe it or not, reveals a lot about history, migration patterns, and the fascinating world of DNA. Whether you're interested in genetics or just enjoy learning about human history, you'll find this topic as interesting as it is revealing. Now, before we jump into the details, I encourage you to stick with me until the end of the video. By the time we're done, you'll not only understand the genetic connections between these countries, but also how history, culture, and even geography play such a vital role in shaping the genetic makeup of people across these nations. So, let's start exploring. When we think about genetic similarities, what we're really talking about is how much DNA different groups of people share. It's an amazing way to trace our roots, understand how we're connected, and dive into the fascinating history of human movement and settlement. In the case of the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, the genetic similarities are actually quite striking, and there are several reasons for this shared DNA. First, let's talk geography. All three of these countries are part of the larger region known as Scandinavia, located in Northern Europe. They share a border and have been part of a single cultural and historical region for centuries. This geographical proximity has played a huge role in their shared genetic makeup. While each country has its own distinct culture and language, their histories have been closely intertwined, particularly during the Viking Age. The Vikings, who came from what we now know as Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, were incredibly influential. They didn't just conquer new lands, they also traded, settled, and explored vast areas of Europe, spreading their genes along the way. Many of the genetic markers found in modern Scandinavian populations can be traced back to these Viking roots. This shared ancestry creates a significant overlap in the genetic profiles of people from these countries. In addition to the shared Viking heritage, geography also played a major role in fostering the mixing of populations. Even though Sweden, Norway, and Denmark are distinct nations, they have remained relatively close to one another throughout history. The landmasses are physically connected, and trade routes, migrations, and alliances between these countries were common over the centuries. As a result, people from different areas of Scandinavia intermarried and mixed their genetic material, which led to the high degree of genetic similarity we see today. Despite the closeness of these countries, there are still some small but important differences in the genetic makeup of their populations. This is largely due to local factors like geographical isolation and regional migration patterns. For example, the northern regions of Norway and Sweden, particularly in more mountainous and remote areas, have been more isolated from external influences. This isolation has helped preserve a more homogeneous gene pool, where the populations remain genetically similar to each other and to early Scandinavian populations. People in these areas have historically had fewer opportunities for mixing with outside populations, which means their genetic profiles are often closer to each other, reflecting the early genetic makeup of the region. On the other hand, southern parts of Sweden and Norway, as well as Denmark, have historically been more connected to other parts of Europe. Denmark, being centrally located in Europe and with a more open landscape, saw more interaction with neighboring countries, particularly Germany. This brought in additional genetic markers from Central European populations. However, even with these small differences, the overall genetic makeup of all three countries is still very similar. So, when it comes to the genetic connection between Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, it's clear that these populations share a large portion of their DNA. Whether it's through their Viking past, shared history of trade and migration, or geographic proximity, these countries are deeply connected genetically. Even though each has unique features shaped by local factors, the genetic similarities far outweigh the differences. The common thread between these countries is strong, and it tells the story of a shared history that continues to be reflected in their people's DNA today. Let's take a closer look at the genetic connection between Sweden and Norway. These two countries are often referred to as genetic cousins, and there's a very good reason for that. Their shared history, culture, and geography have all played significant roles in shaping the genetic makeup of their populations. First off, Sweden and Norway were once united under a single kingdom, known as the Kalmar Union, from 1397 to 1523. Even after the dissolution of this union, the countries continued to have close ties. People moved freely between the two nations, and this constant exchange and mixing of populations helped to maintain a strong genetic connection between Swedes and Norwegians. This long history of interaction ensured that their genetic makeup remained similar, especially when it comes to the northern regions of both countries, where people have lived in close proximity for centuries. Geography is another important factor. Sweden and Norway share a long border, and they are geographically very close to each other. The northern parts of both countries are particularly connected, with small towns and villages right along the border. In these areas, families have lived for generations, mixing and intermarrying. This close-knit connection, particularly in rural areas, has led to a high degree of genetic similarity. Populations living in these more isolated northern regions have had less exposure to outside genetic influences, further strengthening the genetic bond between the two countries. One of the most significant historical factors contributing to the genetic similarity between Sweden and Norway is the Viking Age. The Vikings, who originated in what is now Norway and Sweden, spread their influence across all of Scandinavia and beyond. As they traveled, traded, and settled in different parts of Europe, they left a lasting genetic impact. Because both Swedes and Norwegians share this Viking ancestry, many of the same genetic markers can be found in both populations. In fact, a lot of the DNA linked to Viking heritage is still present in both Swedish and Norwegian populations today. These Viking-related genetic markers are particularly strong in the northern regions of both Sweden and Norway, where the Viking influence remains stronger for a longer period due to less genetic mixing with other populations. This makes the genetic connection between Swedes and Norwegians even more apparent in these northern areas. So, in short, the genetic ties between Sweden and Norway are so strong that, in certain regions, distinguishing between the two genetically can be quite difficult. The shared Viking history, geographic proximity, and ongoing cultural connections have shaped their populations to be remarkably similar. Now that we've established how closely related Swedes and Norwegians are, let's take a look at the genetic relationship between Swedes and Danes. While Denmark is geographically located just south of Sweden, there are some unique factors that influence the genetic connection between these two populations. The Danes share much of the same genetic heritage as Swedes, but the story is a bit more complex. Denmark's location at the southern tip of Scandinavia means that its history has been shaped by more diverse external influences. While Sweden and Norway were historically less influenced by other countries, Denmark was more integrated with neighboring populations from Central and Northern Europe, particularly Germany. This geographic proximity to Germany meant that Denmark experienced more frequent interactions with Germanic tribes and other European groups over the centuries, which likely contributed to some subtle differences in the genetic makeup of the Danish people. That said, Denmark and Sweden share a long history of interaction, both in terms of trade and culture. For centuries, the two countries were part of the same political union, known as the Kalmar Union, which lasted from 1397 to 1523. Even though the political connection ended, the cultural and genetic ties between the two countries remained strong. In fact, Danish and Swedish people share a great deal of their ancient genetic markers, particularly in areas that border Sweden and Denmark. When it comes to genetics, the populations of Sweden and Denmark are very similar, but they are not quite as genetically alike as Sweden and Norway. Research on genetic markers reveals that, while the two populations share a significant portion of their DNA, Danes tend to have a slightly higher genetic influence from Central Europe due to their historical ties with the Germanic populations. This is a result of the genetic mixing that occurred over many centuries of interaction. While these differences are relatively small, they do exist. The gene flow from other European populations has made the Danish genetic profile somewhat more diverse compared to their Swedish counterparts. However, the difference is not vast, and many genetic studies still classify Swedes and Danes as having a very close genetic relationship. In summary, while the genetic connection between Sweden and Denmark is strong, it is not as close as the connection between Sweden and Norway. The external influences on Denmark's population, particularly from Germanic tribes, have introduced some subtle genetic distinctions. But overall, the two countries share much of the same Northern European ancestry. Now, let's take a closer look at the genetic differences between Norway and Denmark. While both countries share many similarities with Sweden, they have some key distinctions that set them apart from each other. These differences largely stem from their unique geography, historical migrations, and external influences. One of the major factors that influence genetic differences between Norway and Denmark is geography. Norway's terrain is famously rugged, with mountains and fjords dominating much of the country. This natural isolation, particularly in the northern and rural regions, has played a significant role in preserving a more homogeneous gene pool. In the past, this rough landscape made it harder for people to travel or migrate from other regions, keeping the genetic makeup of the population more consistent. As a result, Norwegians, especially in the northern regions, have had fewer opportunities for mixing with outside populations. This geographical isolation helped maintain a genetic profile closely tied to other Scandinavian groups, such as the Swedes, with many shared markers from ancient Northern European tribes. Denmark, on the other hand, has a much different geographical and historical setup. Denmark's flat landscape and strategic location made it a crossroads for migration and trade between Northern and Central Europe. For centuries, Denmark has been a major hub for exchanges between Scandinavian and Germanic populations, as well as groups from even farther afield. This openness to outside influences, particularly from Germanic and Central European groups, has led to a more diverse genetic profile for the Danish population. Unlike Norway, Denmark's location made it easier for people to migrate and intermingle with populations from southern Europe, which contributed additional genetic diversity. While the genetic differences between Norwegians and Danes aren't huge, they are still noticeable in some specific genetic markers. For example, Norwegians have a higher frequency of certain genetic traits associated with Scandinavian populations, including markers related to Viking ancestry. Vikings originated from Norway and Sweden, so it makes sense that these populations would share more similar markers linked to their Viking heritage. Danes, on the other hand, have a more varied genetic profile, with certain markers associated with Central and Western European populations, reflecting the greater external genetic influences they've had over time. In the end, the differences are relatively small. Both populations share significant genetic similarities with each other and with Sweden. The key takeaway here is that Norway's more isolated geography preserved a more homogeneous gene pool, while Denmark's location at the crossroads of Northern and Central Europe allowed for more external genetic mixing. This subtle distinction is what sets the genetic profiles of Norwegians and Danes apart. Now that we've examined the historical and geographical influences on the genetics of Swedes, Norwegians, and Danes, it's time to dive deeper into some concrete evidence from genetic research. These studies provide valuable insights into just how closely related these populations are, giving us a clearer picture of the genetic connections that tie them together and where the differences lie. One of the most important studies in this area is the Nordic Genome Project, which analyzed DNA samples from across Scandinavia. This large-scale study found that Norwegians and Swedes are the most genetically similar, with shared DNA markers dating back thousands of years to early Northern European populations. The findings from this research reinforce the idea that geography and shared history between Sweden and Norway have played a significant role in shaping their genetic makeup. It also confirmed that the genetic differences between Norway and Sweden are minimal, with most of the variation being due to regional differences within each country. For instance, while people in northern Sweden and Norway show particularly close genetic ties due to their isolated, mountainous geography, variations occur as you move southwards and populations mix more. However, this study also showed that Danes, while still genetically close to Swedes and Norwegians, have a slight distinction in their DNA. The Danish population was found to have a higher frequency of genetic markers associated with Central European populations. This can be attributed to Denmark's strategic location as a historical crossroads for migration and trade between Northern Europe and Central Europe. Throughout history, Denmark was frequently exposed to influences from Germanic and other Central European populations, which led to the mixing of genetic material. As a result, Danes tend to have a slightly more diverse genetic profile compared to their Swedish and Norwegian counterparts. Another significant study, genomic dissection of the population structure of Scandinavia, provided further confirmation of these findings. It noted that the genetic structure of all three countries is primarily shaped by ancient Northern European ancestry, but the proportion of genetic material from Central European populations was higher in Denmark than in Norway and Sweden. This research highlights the genetic impact of Denmark's geographical position and its more frequent contact with Central European groups. In addition to these major studies, more localized research has focused on specific genetic markers, particularly those linked to Viking ancestry. Studies have shown that these markers are found in higher concentrations in Norwegians and Swedes compared to Danes. This aligns with the historical Viking migrations, which originated primarily in Norway and Sweden and spread across Europe, influencing the genetic structure of these regions. Taken together, these genetic studies make it clear that while all three populations share significant genetic overlap, Norwegians and Swedes are the most closely related, followed by Danes. The Danish genetic profile shows some unique markers due to external influences, but they still share much of their ancestry with their Scandinavian neighbors. So, after all this exploration, what's the final takeaway? Who has the closest DNA to Swedes, Norwegians, or Danes? The answer is clear. Norwegians have the closest genetic connection to Swedes. This is due to their shared history, geography, and Viking ancestry. However, Danes also share a strong genetic bond with Swedes, though their DNA shows slightly more influence from Central European populations, thanks to Denmark's location and historical ties with Germany. But here's an interesting question to think about. If all three populations are so genetically similar, what do you think really sets them apart, culturally, linguistically, and socially? Could it be the subtle differences in DNA that have influenced their traditions and ways of life over centuries? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more fascinating content. And if you found this video insightful, share it with a friend who's curious about Scandinavian history and genetics. Thanks for watching.